Hello and welcome to Little Miss Sleepy Dead. If you're new here, we are a brand new channel. Really appreciate if you could like this video and please subscribe for more content. Now let's get into story number 1. So this story has been sent in by Laura, and at the time she was 15 years old. And she's basically saying that she lived over the road from an old medieval castle. She loved the place. She played on there with the siblings on the castle grounds. When it was snowing, they'd get the sledges out and they'd go down the hills on the castle. Proper quintessential England. So when Laura was about 15, she had to take part in what, in England we call work experience. I don't know what you call it in any other country. Basically, it was introduced in the 1970s. Children of about 15 years old, just before they left high school, would spend 2 weeks working in a place of their choosing. So basically they'd choose where they wanted to work, maybe where their parents worked, maybe their local shop. Maybe if they wanted to be a farmer, they'd go and ask if they could do 2 weeks work experience on the local farm. Well, Laura, she chose the castle. The castle over the road from her house that she'd played at as a child. So Laura got really stuck into this. She really enjoyed it. She went out digging, looking for artifacts, really got stuck in. And as the 2 weeks progressed, she was given more and more responsibility. Now, towards the end of the second week, Laura was actually giving guided tours. Bearing in mind that she'd grown up around this castle, so she knew the history very, very well. Now, one evening, Laura was locking up. She was walking around the keep, making sure all the internal doors were closed, making sure there was no rubbish lying around, and making sure the last tourist of the day had left the building. Now, what Laura says is she came back the following morning, and for the first time she was given the opportunity to open up the keep. She vividly remembers that the key for the door to this big old castle was huge. It was a big medieval iron key. Now, she opened up on her own. Takes some guts, guys, to do that. 15-year-old walking around a castle on her own. On one of the upper floors was a chapel, only a small place. As she walked up to it, she opened up the big heavy door and immediately saw something lying on the ground. This wasn't anything incredible. It wasn't anything spectacular. And she did say that if she'd not been the one to check the floors the previous night, she would have completely overlooked it. On the floor was a patch of what she called wax. She said her memory has faded over time, but she recalls it being a creamy, yellowy, maybe even a greenish tinted hard set wax, almost like from a wax melt or a candle. She scraped it up, threw it out the window, and thought nothing else of it. Now, later that afternoon, Laura was actually sat in the visitors centre with Dave. Now, Dave was an old gentleman who had taken Laura under his wing. He had basically known Laura's granddad from the village. They'd been down the pit together, so he had a lot of respect for the family. And I think this probably played a large part into why Laura enjoyed her experience so much. She relayed the story of what she'd found on the floor to Dave, and apparently Dave was wide-eyed. And now, David worked at this castle for a long time, decades. He knew the area very well, he knew all the folklores. He stood up and he walked over to a filing system at the other side of the visitors centre and he pulled out a piece of paper. Dave handed this paper to Laura and straight away she recognised it. This was a sketch, an old black and white copy of a sketch from the 1500s, and on there was a crude drawing of the chapel in the castle. Laura says that the hairs on the back of her neck stood up because on this drawing, in the chapel, was the image of a monk. It was a depiction of a ghostly encounter. The local who had witnessed the sight had committed it to memory and then had it recreated in the form of a drawing. That sketch still exists to this day. The castle that Laura was actually working in had a very strong ghost story connected to it. So apparently in the 1300s, a monk from a neighbouring village was imprisoned in this castle by the Earl at the time. And it's strongly believed that the monk haunts the hallways and the rooms and the stairwells of the castle. Now, there's nothing new there. Almost every old building in the country has some kind of apparition or ghost story attached to it. But what's different is the picture that Laura held in her hand had a monk stood in the chapel holding a candle. And from this candle, it can be clearly seen the wax dripping into a pool on the floor, in the very spot that Laura saw the wax that very same morning. Story number 2. This is Karl's story. It was the year 2000, and Karl was about 22 years old. He worked for a small haulage company in North Yorkshire, England. Now, Karl had been asked to transport some spare parts up to one of the company's branches in Scotland, just north of Dundee. Now, Karl really didn't want to do this trip. He had a knot of unease in the pit of his stomach. At home, his girlfriend at the time, Jen, was expecting their first baby and she was due any day. Regardless, Karl set off just after lunchtime. About 4 hours into his journey, Karl stopped and took a break for about 30 minutes. He said he sat and enjoyed the scenery whilst eating the sandwiches that Jen had prepared for him that very morning. Now, what Karl states is this was before the days of sat-nav, and he was using an old road atlas. He was familiar with the road just as far as Perth, as the company had a branch there and he'd been there several times. To get him from Perth to the town he was heading to, he'd written a little list of basic directions, just enough to get him in the right area. From there, if he was struggling, he knew he could stop and ask for directions. Karl was about 2 miles away from his destination. It was about 7 o'clock at night. It was a dark, miserable, wet English evening. At one point, Karl said he remembers driving down a narrow lane believing it was heading in the right direction, and it turns out that it was another dead end and he had to reverse his van all the way back for almost 1/4 mile. When he'd finally backed out of the lane, he tried to make his way back to the main road. Now, this is where things get interesting because he said he didn't recognise anything from the way in. None of the street signs were familiar to him, and he was now starting to panic that he didn't actually know where he was. Karl was a very happy-go-lucky, very laid-back kind of guy, but what he said is at this point he started to feel extremely anxious. Karl drove for another 100 yards or so with this nagging feeling eating away at him. As he came over the brow of the hill, he did say that he saw a bridge in front of him. He thought nothing of it, and as he drove over the bridge, this intense feeling just got stronger and stronger. Once he got to the other side, he said that the sensation was as though somebody had their hands around his neck, to the point where he actually had to pull over and take a minute. Karl admits that he was extremely relieved when, after driving for another minute or so, he actually pulled into the forecourt of the garage. Once in there, Karl unloaded his boxes and then asked for directions to the inn in which he was booked in for the evening. He asked the old guy which was the best way out, should he retrace his steps going back over the old bridge. The old guy was very adamant on the route that Karl should take back out of the village, and he made it very clear under no circumstances must Karl head back over that bridge. Now, Karl found this very strange, and he didn't question it any further, but it did play on his mind. Once he'd reached the inn in which he was booked into for the night, he took his bags up to his room, then went down to the bar area for a quick drink before bed. This is when Karl got talking to the landlady, an older lady, very friendly, and he actually recalls that she commented on how tired he looked. Obviously, Karl told her all about his long journey that day, but also mentioned that he'd come over feeling quite ill only an hour before, just before he actually entered the village, even making fun that maybe his girlfriend at home had tried to poison him with the sandwiches that she'd made. And this is where things take a strange turn. The landlady turned to Karl and asked him which way he'd entered into the village, specifically asking, "Did you cross the bridge?" Now, at this point, Karl was like, what is the issue with this bridge? First the guy at the garage, now you. Tell me, why can I not cross that bridge? Karl says that with the most serious look he's ever seen on anybody's face, the landlady turned to him and said, "A young woman hung herself from that bridge years ago, or so the story goes. Many locals believe her husband did it. She haunts that bridge. You won't catch a local going anywhere near it. There's been 3 accidents in the past 2 years. Stay away. Now, Karl admits that he loved a good old ghost story, but until that night never actually believed that they could be true. It unnerved him so much that he hardly slept that night, and the next morning got up at the crack of dawn and drove home. He said he has never been north of the border since.